Hey everyone, this is Teresa from Base 10 Montessori, and today we are going to go over Chapter 20 of The Absorbent Mind by Maria Montessori. And this chapter is titled Character Building is the Child's Own Achievement. Before we begin, I just want to bring up a few things for you to think about as we're going through this chapter. So something that might be good to think about while you're reading this chapter is to review the planes of development. Now, if you're familiar with Montessori, you know that we have different planes of development for each age group. There's the 0 to 6 age group, the 6 to 12, the 12 to 18, and the 18 to 24 age group. So in Montessori, we think of development through those 4 planes of development. And I am going to go through a little bit of an overview of the first and second planes of development before we dive into this chapter, just in case there's anybody who's not quite familiar with Montessori and wants to have that background before we begin this chapter. As we go through this chapter, I want you to think critically about Montessori's psychological analysis of social types. This is what we're going to be talking about in this chapter, and I'd be interested to hear from you. Do you think this is controversial? Do you think it's outdated? Or do you find her ideas of social types to be accurate? I also want you to think about the concrete lessons in the Montessori environment. So if you're going through training, or if you're working in a Montessori environment, or you just have some familiarity with Montessori, I want you to think about how our lessons in the Montessori environment develop character. For instance, why do we use glass in our classrooms instead of plastic? Why do we limit materials? Why do we usually only say in the 0 to 6 environment that one child can work with one material and we don't have duplicate materials? Why do we complete a work cycle? Why do we include care of self and care of environment in our lessons? How does the work in the Montessori environment build character through actively being engaged in a task versus lecturing or commanding children to be good or be respectful? So as we go through this chapter on character development and building character and how children, especially children in that 0 to 6 environment, build character, I want you to think about the types of things that you're seeing in the Montessori environment and how that affects the development of character. And then I want you to think about people who lecture and moralize to their children. And I'm talking about the children between the ages of 0 to 6. Instead of actively engaging them in consequences of their behavior and the character building experiences, which need no words, only action and experience. And I'm going to come back to this. We're going to talk our way through this chapter, and we're going to come back to all these ideas at the very end. And I want you to think about, in that 0 to 6 age group, what's really going on there with development. And of course, we're also going to think about how that changes in the second plane of development, when you can start lecturing and moralizing to children about their behavior, about what's going on in the world. Because it does change how we approach character development, and building character does change in the different planes of development. So let's talk about this first plane of development. This is the age of 0 to 6, and Montessori calls this the creation of the individual. And there are 2 phases. There's the creation phase and the consolidation phase. So that creation phase is 0 to 3, and then the consolidation phase is the ages 3 to 6. And during this time, the child goes from an unconscious mind to a conscious, concrete sensorial learner. During the ages of 0 to 6, there are sensitive periods. And this is when the child is remarkably sensitive to order, refinement of the senses, refinement of movement, and language. And they ask questions like, what is this? What is that? So this age group is defined by those questions. And of course, a big part of development in the 0 to 6 age group is the development of independence. And we like to call this the help me do it myself stage. And to understand Montessori's mindset just a little bit more, I'm going to include a quote from page 24 of The Absorbent Mind, where Montessori says, "When we understand that the energies belong to an unconscious mind, which has to become conscious through work and through an experience of life gained in the world, we realize that the mind of the child in infancy is different than ours, that we cannot reach it by verbal instruction." And I think that quote really is a good way to understand this first plane of development and how it relates to the character building we're going to talk about later on. So let's contrast the first plane of development to the second plane of development. This is the 6 to 12 age group, and Montessori called this the age of instruction. And in this age group, the child switches from a concrete learner to an abstract learner. And in this age group, they can acquire a vast amount of knowledge. And instead of asking, what is this and what is that, they ask why and how. And in this age group, they can be reasoned with, and they don't accept commands without understanding why, because they have this preoccupation with fairness and moral justice. They will test what they have learned in that first plane of development. And they still have a need for order. It's still necessary in this age group, but it is displayed in the reordering and reorganization of the imaginative and abstract mind. And then, of course, they switch from an individual learner in that 0 to 6 age group to a group learner in the 6 to 12 age group. And so this is a very abstract stage that's very different from the first 6 years of life. And if you're noticing that the external world of the 6 to 12-year-old seems to get messier and a little more chaotic, it's because there's a lot of abstract learning and development going on. They're reorganizing the inside of their mind and not their outward environment anymore. So you'll notice that there is a change in their behavior. They might become messier as they go along because they're trying to do an internal reorganization. And then, of course, in the ages of 12 to 18, everything's going to change again. And actually, 12 to 18-year-olds, that age group, that third plane of development, mirrors in a lot of ways the first plane of development. You're going to find that in the third plane, they are needing to work with their hands again. And we like to call them big toddlers when they get to that third plane of development. So that's just a little bit of an overview of the planes of development before we get into this chapter. And I think that's really going to help set the foundation for what we're talking about in this chapter. Now, as we begin this chapter, I'd actually like to start with some quotes from the end of the chapter, because really what we're talking about is education, right? We're talking about all of this in the context of education. And I wanted to frame this chapter from the standpoint of there is a problem we need to solve. And what's interesting is that the problem that Montessori was trying to solve in her time is the same problem we're still trying to solve in modern education. And on page 192, she says, "Too many need crutches to hold them up. And if the world keeps on with education as it is, the level of mankind will sink even lower. The education of today is humiliating. It produces an inferiority complex and artificially lowers the powers of man. Its very organization sets a limit to knowledge well below the natural level. It supplies men with crutches when they could run on swift feet. And it is man's own fault if the majority of human beings are inferior, for the formation of their characters during the constructive period has been prevented." And so with that in mind, let's approach this chapter. And my thoughts going into this chapter, mine personally, is that before we can educate character in the second plane of development, we must build it, not command it, in the first plane of development. And if you're not quite understanding what I'm meaning by that, I think as we walk through this chapter, you're going to see that. You're going to understand that to a greater extent. So let's begin on page 187. And she's going to talk about the planes of development and character building. She says, as explained in the preceding chapter, children construct their own characters, building up in themselves the qualities we admire. The only thing we can do is to put education on a scientific footing so that children can work effectively without being disturbed or impeded. Only later on is it possible to tackle the child's mind in a direct way, by means of reasoning and exhortation. Not till 6 we become missionaries of morality, because it is between 6 and 12 that conscience begins to function and the child is able to visualize the problems of good and evil. Still more can be done between 12 and 18, when the child begins to have ideals, patriotic, social, religious, and the like. Then we can act as missionaries towards him, as we can to adults. The pity of it is that after 6, children can no longer develop character and its qualities spontaneously. Thenceforward, the missionaries, who are also imperfect, find themselves faced by considerable difficulties. And I don't know about you, but for me, I find this to really resonate with some of the experiences I've had. I've had experiences teaching in the 0 to 6 age group, and I've also worked in lower elementary. So I've gotten to see the two groups, I've gotten to experience both, and I've got to observe both. And with my background in being AMI trained in the primary age group, you really get to understand that you cannot directly educate that 0 to 6 age group. You have to have them absorb everything. We call the primary guide a link to the materials. We're not a teacher in that environment. We are the link. We link the child to the experiences they have, and it is the experience that teaches the child. And we'll get into that a little bit more later, but let's move on to the next set of quotes. On page 187, she continues to talk about character development, and she talks about the lack of character. She says, teachers of youth often complain that although they can teach the subjects of science and literature and so on, the pupils before them are unable to learn. And this is not for lack of intelligence, but for lack of character. Without character, there is no drive. Only those who, despite early tantrums and wrong treatment, have succeeded in keeping some or all of the basic gifts of character have any personality left. Too often, the majority have none. To tell these to concentrate is now useless, for this is just the power they cannot exert. How can we expect them to do their work carefully and patiently if care and patience are among their missing gifts? Qualities like this can only be given by practice, never by command. And so what she's talking about here is that we are developing these gifts in the 0 to 6 age group. And if we don't develop it in that age group, it becomes very difficult to educate children when they get to that second plane of development. So if we want them to be patient when they get into that 6 to 12 age group, we must build it up through experience in that first plane of development. So for instance, if we only have one of each type of material on the shelf, and there are 3 students who want to work with the same material, and you're in that 3 to 6 age group, they have to learn to wait until someone is finished. We are not lecturing them. We are not commanding them to be patient. We are developing an environment where the child has to experience being patient. So we plan our environments and create our environments very carefully so the environment teaches the student how to build character. And I say this as someone whose background is in early childhood education. Before I got my Montessori credentials, I had an early childhood education degree, and I worked in childcare where there were tons of the same toys, and all the children could work with the same toys, and everybody had to share. So that was my first experience with this age group. And it wasn't until I got to Montessori that I realized we could do things differently. That, first of all, children in the 0 to 6 age group can wait. You can't take away someone else's work. We are not forcing this age group to share. In my classrooms, in the 3 to 6 age group classrooms that I am certified in, if a child wants to work on a material, they have to wait because the material is scarce and special. And that teaches virtue. And so the experience of patience is better than telling a child, you need to develop patience. And that's what she's talking about here. We are developing these qualities because we're allowing the child to practice them. We're not commanding them. We're not lecturing them. We're not moralizing them in the 3 to 6 age group. We're allowing them to practice it. And we are creating an environment where they experience the need for developing those virtues. On page 188, she talks about the human instinct for progression. She says time and patience can affect nothing by themselves. We have to profit by the chance offered in the creative period, which is the 0 to 6 age group. Both the individual and society have this in common, a continuous tendency to progress. Man's behavior is not invariable like that of the animals, but it can progress. And it is natural for man to feel this urge to go forward. So again, she's talking about the fact that time and patience isn't enough. Allowing them to just grow up and mature is not enough. We have to create an environment and create lessons that offer a chance to create virtues that build character through experience with the world, through concrete work in that 0 to 6 age group. Only then can we build upon that in that second plane of development. If you're wondering why in that second plane of development in ages 6 to 12, we're seeing children who can't focus, who can't concentrate, who are not patient, who have not learned those really important skills, it's because they're not being developed in the 0 to 6 age group, right? When you go into a child care center like the ones I used to work at, I'm kind of horrified when I think back at everything I used to do in my early childhood classrooms because it didn't teach character building. If we wanted to teach character building in early childhood, we'd read them a book, which is kind of like that moralizing, right? We'd moralize to them about what it's like to be a good person, right? We'd open up a book, tell a story about a virtue. Where in Montessori, we're creating a concrete experience. We're creating an environment where they have to experience a consequence for their behavior. Like, for instance, if I don't move carefully, this fragile piece of glass that I'm working with is going to break. And if it breaks, I don't get to do this work. And we don't use plastic in a Montessori environment because plastic doesn't have a consequence. You don't have to be careful with plastic materials. You do have to be careful in a Montessori classroom or our materials break. And so we want to create opportunities to develop character through experience with the world. Further on page 188, she talks about adaptation. And of course, right here, she's going to get into some strong language, and just keep in mind that this book was written a long time ago. So, there are going to be some maybe different terms than what we would use in modern educational books. But right here, she says, lunatics and criminals have not been able to adapt themselves to social life. All the rest have made the adaptation more or less. Problems of education, therefore, concern those who have been able to, up to a point, remain within the compass of adaptation. This adaptation to the world about one occurs in the first 6 years. Here then are to be found the origins of character. So again, she talks about how important it is to get these experiences with the world in the age of 0 to 6, because when you get past that age, it's not so easy. That building up of character has to happen early on when the child can just absorb it and the environment can teach them. Once you get past that, you're in for a really rough ride in the following years if you don't develop that early on. On page 190, we're going to talk about figure 11 that she puts in her book. And this will be interesting. I would love to hear from you on this. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. This is one I'm curious about whether or not this is outdated, if people agree with it. What do you like about this idea and what do you not like about this idea? And I'd love to hear from you on this. But she talks about here the circles of attraction for superior and inferior social types. And at the middle, at the center of this circle, the smallest circle, she says superior evolution is at the center of this. And then these are people who are really geared in towards perfection and self-perfection. And then as you go further out, you're going to have those extra social and antisocial personalities on the extreme end of that. And everybody between those two extremes, they either get pulled towards the circle of self-perfection or outwards towards the extra social or antisocial. So my question here is, how does this psychological and developmental concept of Montessori's fit in with others that we've learned along the way, such as, let's say, Maslow's hierarchy of needs? How would you confirm or contradict her idea of these social types? So I want you to think about that as we move through the rest of this chapter, because she's going to talk a lot about this figure and this idea of being attracted toward that center of self-perfection, or those who maybe are more attracted towards that outward circle. On pages 189 and 190, she's going to go on to talk about the circles of social types. And right here she says the inner circle beyond the core includes those who are fairly near to perfection. They feel in themselves a natural attraction to the center, toward perfection, a true wish to become better. Their search for it is not sacrificial, but is pursued as if it satisfied their deepest longings. They are the strongest, either because they possessed more vital energy or because they were luckier in their environmental conditions, while those of the next circle had less energy or had encountered greater obstacles. The second group tends to slip toward the outer ring, the anti and extra social. And on page 191 to 192, she defines perfection. She asks, what is perfection? And she says, by character, we mean the behavior of men driven, though often unconsciously, to make progress. There is naturally an attraction toward God. This was a man who, being sure of himself, did not have to waste his energies in wrestling with temptation. So this is how she is defining perfection, right? This inner drive, this natural attraction. Somebody who isn't wasting their time with temptation. And on page 192 to 193, she continues on analyzing this idea. And she said, if in man's whole life there is only one time for mental construction, which is the ages of 0 to 6, and if at that time it cannot occur or occurs badly owing to faulty conditions, then it is not surprising that the human masses are underdeveloped. But if character were allowed its natural way of formation, and we gave not moral dissertations but the chance to act constructively, then the world would need a very different kind of education. This is the difference between the old and the new education. We want to help the auto-construction of man at the right time so that mankind can go forward to something great. So again, here we talk about the importance of that 0 to 6 age group. And if things don't occur in that time frame, then we continue on underdeveloped. If we can build up character in that 0 to 6 age group, simply by how we construct our environment, how we construct our lessons, the opportunities that we're giving to our children, to our students, then we can do something entirely different going forward. We can build on the character that's been developed. And she talks about this auto-construction. And when she's talking about auto-construction, I want you to think about the fact that it is not the adult that is building the character in the child, not directly anyways, right? We are responsible for setting the example. We are responsible for being the link to the materials. We are responsible for creating the environment for the 0 to 6-year-old. But we're not doing a direct lesson. We are not moralizing. We are not lecturing. We are not being abstract during this age group. So the child is actually constructing himself through the experiences that we are giving them, because that is far, far greater for a student to experience than the moralizing. For instance, reading a book that moralizes a lesson. And I'm not saying that you can't ever do any of that you can't ever talk about that with your child or with your student, right? That's not really the point. But we want to limit our words with children in this age group. The message should be very clear and concrete and hands-on. Limit your words at this age group. But when they get into that 6 to 12 age group, that's where those deep conversations are going to come in. Remember, in that 6 to 12 age group, they are preoccupied with fairness and moral justice. They want to understand why. In the 0 to 6 age group, they want to understand what. What is patience, right? What is careful? And then in the 6 to 12, you go into that conversation of why are we patient? Why are we careful? Why do we do these things? And how does it affect the greater world, right? That's what the 6 to 12 age group does. In the 0 to 6, we're talking about a concrete time where the child is building up character through experiences with the world. So that's all the quotes I have for this chapter. So let me just give you my thoughts a little bit, and let's go back to some of the things we were discussing at the beginning of this video. And my thought is that far too often we are commanding character in children rather than building it. And why do we do that? And I know from experience, we do that because it is easier for the adult to command it than to take the time and the effort to build it. Building character takes more time and effort because we have to prepare a lesson for the child, and that lesson has to be concrete. We have to create an environment that the child can actively be engaged in that teaches character. We have to follow through with consequences, right? Sometimes we're going to have to put breakable things in our environment, which is frustrating if you're on a budget, if you are really attached to something, or if you are just always afraid that something in your environment is going to break, and you never give your child the chance to work with something that's breakable, then they don't understand consequence, right? If they are throwing their sippy cup across the wall when they get angry, there's no consequence for that behavior, right? But if they're throwing something very beautiful, very fragile, and it breaks and shatters, there's a different consequence there. There's a different feeling to that. And so we have to create an environment that's developmentally appropriate, but also has consequence, because the environment is what teaches the character. And one of the things we need to remember as an adult in that 0 to 6 environment is that we are just there to be the example, to be the link. If I move slowly and carefully, my student will move slowly and carefully. If I treat things with respect, my students are more likely to treat things with respect. If I put things that are breakable in my environment, my student will work more carefully. And we want to encourage that in the 0 to 6 environment, because we're going to do something with that. We need those skills to already be there and be developing, so that in the 6 to 12 age group, we can go deeper into the abstract ideas behind character. So we command children to be respectful rather than allowing them to experience the consequence of not being respectful, right? Because it is often easier for us, the adult. It's often easier for us to put their shoes on for them than take 45 minutes to wait for them to put their shoes on themselves, right? When you are working in a toddler room and you're trying to get them outside and you're trying to get their shoes on them, trying to change their shoes, it is a frustrating experience, and you want nothing more than to just go over there, put their shoes on, and go out on the playground. But that doesn't teach them how to do it themselves, right? Remember, that 0 to 6 age group is all about help me do it myself. And we need to show them that when we have broken materials, they are not easily replaced, right? These are beautiful materials. These are valuable materials. These are materials that we cherish, and when they're broken, they're not necessarily replaceable. And the student will have a consequence. They will experience a consequence for that behavior. And just so you know, this is not just a lesson for children. Sometimes as an adult, we have to relearn this lesson as well. And I have to tell you a little bit of a story about the silk color tablets that my trainer in AMI training brought out for us to work with. Now, for those of you who are familiar with Montessori Materials, we have the box of color tablets so that we can grade the colors from lightest to darkest. And my trainer actually had a set of silk color tablets, very fragile. And she told us from the beginning that we could only touch the ends, the wooden ends of the color tablets, because if we touched the silk threads, it would ruin the material. And so she let us work with that very special material when we were going through training. And I think it was out maybe a couple hours before she had to take it off the shelf and say, you know what? I saw people touching the silk, and now you cannot work with this anymore. And that material never came out again during training because we were not careful. And that was us. We are adults. We're trying to become Montessori teachers, and we could not treat the materials with respect, to the point my trainer had to take that material off the shelf. I never even got to see the material because whoever was working with it was disrespectful. And that never came back out. And so we all lost out because of that. And so we need to experience consequences in our classrooms, in our home environments. And if we're honest, we know that we command children to be careful rather than allowing them the experience, the consequence of not being careful, right? Why? Because it's easier. It's easier to give them plastic instead of glass. We don't want to have to buy new materials all the time because children are breaking them, right? If we're in the middle of a lesson and we hear glass shattering on the ground, the last thing we want to do is stop and have a distraction or make sure somebody is able to clean that up. It's very frustrating to have that consequence, but we need it. So we have to, at some point, find within ourselves the boundaries that we need to set for what's developmentally appropriate for the environment, but also what is going to create a consequence that builds character. Another example is that we command children to focus, to concentrate, rather than protect their concentration when it spontaneously happens in the first plane of development. And if you are a teacher or a parent and you are noticing in your child for the first time they can sit down and do something for about 20 minutes straight, whatever that thing is, whatever that activity is that has just totally captured their attention, that spontaneous concentration that happens, it is an amazing moment. And in the Montessori classroom, we protect that. In that 0 to 6 age group, we work so hard to protect that concentration, because if they can't experience it, if they never have the opportunity to work with something for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and expand all the way up to even an hour or two, what are they going to do in that 6 to 12 environment if they can't focus for even 5 minutes? So we allow that concentration to happen, which is why a lot of individual work happens in that 3 to 6 age group, so that concentration can expand. This is why we're not allowing children to share materials very often in the 3 to 6 age group. It's why it's mostly individual. It's because we need them to be fully engaged in a material that develops concentration. That's a big part of why we do what we do in Montessori. Respecting concentration. We don't tell them to concentrate. We don't tell them to focus. We find the right experience. We find the right material. We connect them with that material. And then concentration spontaneously happens and we protect it. So that that concentration, once experienced on one material, can expand outwards to other materials. And it can be built longer and longer and longer. If you don't do that in the 0 to 6 age group, it's not going to happen very easily in the 6 to 12 age group. And of course, we command children to be patient rather than giving them the experience of waiting. Like I said in the beginning, we don't duplicate materials very often in Montessori because children need to wait their turn. And another example of that would be grace and courtesy lessons, right? Like if you're going to do serving tea as a lesson, you have a little timer out there for your tea bag. They have to wait until that timer is finished in order to take the tea bag out. You can't just drink the tea as soon as you put the tea bag in it, right? We're creating opportunities for them to wait. So our environment allows the child this auto-education. They auto-educate because of the environment. And your role as the adult is to create opportunities and link the child to those opportunities. When you get into the next plane of development, you can start lecturing, you can start digging deeper, but you have to build it. You have to build it in that first plane of development. These experiences need to be built up in the first plane of development if you want them to use those skills and characteristics in the next plane of development, where we begin teaching them formally. They cannot concentrate in the second plane of development if you didn't allow them to experience concentration in the first plane of development. And they cannot be careful with materials in the second plane of development if you did not refine their control and coordination of movement in the first plane of development. And remember that children in the 0 to 6 age group have these sensitive periods for learning these things. And those are windows of opportunities that happen in the first 6 years that will never come again. After the age of 6, it's a whole different ballgame, right? They have to formally learn. They can't absorb. The sensitive periods are not there. Once those windows close in the first plane of development, you don't get to have them back. So the sensitive period for the refinement of the senses, the refinement of movement, the sensitive period for order, the sensitive period for language, they don't go forward with the child. They still have a need for order, right? But they don't have a sensitive period for order in the second plane of development. And so we really have to capitalize on this very special time in the human existence. 0 to 6 is the most important time to educate children, but we don't do it formally. We don't do it directly. We do it through being a connection to the environment, creating an environment, connecting them to the materials, and allowing the child to experience the world in a way that helps build up their character. So that is all I have to say on chapter 20. I hope to hear from you. I hope to hear your thoughts down in the comment section below. Don't forget that I'm going to put links in the comment section below. And with that being said, don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe to this channel, and I will see you in the next video.